On the discussion, and I welcome you all to come in on the discussion. This is the time to dialogue because this impacts you. You're our future leaders, and what you say matters. What you do counts. And so, you know, definitely chime in on this. How can we learn from each other? Okay? So, Dr. Moore.
All right, welcome back. This is not my social one-on-one. I would like to just give you a couple of questions for you to think about during this, the listening of MLK's, the London speech. And that was done in December 7, 1964, and I was amazed at the things that he was talking about in order to get rid of racism, racial segregation, and many other things such as stereotypes and prejudice, and you could go on and on and on. Two questions that I would like to share with you so we can all think about these two questions. The first question that I would like to pose is, since the Civil Rights Bill, has America made progress towards MLK's idealized society? In other words, what is really ideal society? He talks about that. And second question, this was really, really shocking to me because, you know, I've been in academia for over 20 years, and the separation between religion and politics was supposed to be, you know, in every area of American society. But he does talk about in this film Christian love, and I was just shocked. Oh my goodness gracious. So does our Christian love today resemble MLK's idea or version of love, such as like a non-violence? So let's watch it and then chew it, and we'll have a Q&A session. Yes? Can you repeat the first question? Since the Civil Rights, has America made progress towards Martin Luther King's idealized society or ideal society? And the second question is, he talks about Christian love. Christian love, not like a, you know, love that you guys think about, you know, like a sensual and affectionate. No, this is the fundamental. Yes, fundamental love beyond yourself, and that's he was talking about that, and it's just an incredible speech. So let's watch it together. Okay, thank you.
I am happy. I am happy. I have a dream.
This is Democracy Now!
Fleecy locks and black complexion cannot forfeit nature's claim. Skin may differ, but affection dwells in black and white the same. And were I so tall as to reach the pole or to grasp the ocean at a span, I must be measured by my soul. The mind is the standard of the man.
In a Democracy Now! And Pacifica Radio Archives exclusive, we air a newly discovered recording of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. It was December 1964, days before he received the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo. Dr. King gave a major address in London on segregation, the fight for civil rights, and his support for Nelson Mandela and the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa.
If the United Kingdom and the United States decided tomorrow morning not to buy South African goods, not to buy South African gold, if our investors and capitalists would withdraw their support for the racial tyranny that we find there, then apartheid would be brought to an end.
Today, Dr. King's City Temple Address, December 7th, 1964, in London. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I am Amy Goodman. Today is the federal holiday honoring Dr. Martin Luther King. He was born January 15, 1929. He was assassinated April 4, 1968, at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. He was just 39 years old. While Dr. King is primarily remembered as a civil rights leader, he also championed the cause of the poor, organizing the Poor People's Campaign to address issues of economic justice. Dr. King was also a fierce critic of U.S. foreign policy and the Vietnam War. In 1964, Dr. King became the youngest recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. Days before he received that award in Oslo, Norway, Dr. King traveled to London. On December 7, 1964, Dr. King gave a speech sponsored by the British group Christian Action about the civil rights struggle in the United States, as well as the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. The speech was recorded by Saul Bernstein, who was working as the European correspondent for Pacifica Radio. Bernstein's recording was recently discovered by Brian DeShazer, director of the Pacifica Radio Archives. This is that address by Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
I want to talk with you mainly about our struggle in the United States, and before taking my seat, talk about some of the larger struggles in the whole world, and some of the more difficult struggles in places like South Africa. But that is a desperate, poignant question on the lips of people all over our country and all over the world. I get it almost everywhere I go and almost every press conference. It is a question of whether we are making any real progress in the struggle to make racial justice a reality in the United States of America. And whenever I seek to answer that question, on the one hand, I seek to avoid an undue pessimism. On the other hand, I seek to avoid a superficial optimism. And I try to incorporate or develop what I consider a realistic position by admitting on the one hand that we have made many significant strides over the last few years in the struggle for racial justice, but by admitting that before the problem is solved, we still have numerous things to do and many challenges to meet. And it is this realistic position that I would like to use as a basis for our thinking together tonight as we think about the problem in the United States. We have come a long, long way, but we have a long, long way to go before the problem is solved. Now let us notice first that we've come a long, long way, and I would like to say at this point that the Negro himself has come a long, long way in re-evaluating his own intrinsic worth. Now, in order to illustrate this, a little history is necessary. It was in the year 1619 when the first Negro slaves landed on the shores of America. And they were brought there from the soils of Africa. Unlike the Pilgrim Fathers who landed at Plymouth a year later, they were brought there against their wills. And throughout slavery, the Negro was treated in a very inhuman fashion. He was a thing to be used, not a person to be respected. The United States Supreme Court rendered a decision in 1857 known as the Dred Scott decision, which well illustrated what existed at that time. But in this decision, the Supreme Court of the United States said in substance that the Negro is not a citizen of the United States. He is merely property subject to the dictates of his owner. And it went on to say that the Negro has no rights that the white man is bound to respect. And this was the idea that prevailed during the days of slavery. With the growth of slavery, it became necessary to give some justification for it. You know, it seems to be a fact of life that human beings cannot continue to do wrong without eventually reaching out for some thin rationalization to clothe an obvious wrong in the beautiful garments of righteousness. And this is exactly what happened during the days of slavery. There were those who even misused the Bible and religion to give some justification for slavery and to crystallize the patterns of the status quo. And so it was argued from some pulpits that the Negro was inferior by nature because of Noah's curse upon the children of Ham. And then the Apostle Paul's dictum became a watchword: servants, be obedient to your master. And one brother had probably read the logic of the great philosopher Aristotle. You know, Aristotle did a great deal to bring into being what we now know as formal logic in philosophy. And in formal logic, that is a big word known as the syllogism, which has a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. And so this brother decided to put his argument for the inferiority of the Negro in the framework of an Aristotelian syllogism. He could say all men are made in the image of God. This was the major premise. Then came the minor premise: God, as everybody knows, is not a Negro, therefore the Negro is not a man. This was the kind of reasoning that prevailed. Well, living with the conditions of slavery and then later segregation, many Negroes lost faith in themselves. Many came to feel that perhaps they were less than human. Many came to feel that they were inferior. This, it seems to me, is the greatest tragedy of slavery, the greatest tragedy of segregation, not merely what it does to the individual physically, but what it does to one psychologically. It scars the soul of the segregated as well as the segregator. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority, while leaving the segregated with a false sense of inferiority. And this is exactly what happened. But then something happened to the Negro, and circumstances made it possible and necessary for him to travel more. The coming of the automobile, the upheavals of 2 world wars, the Great Depression. And so his rural plantation background gradually gave way to urban industrial life. His economic life was gradually rising through the growth of industry, the development of organized labor, and expanded educational opportunities. And even his cultural life was gradually rising through the steady decline of crippling illiteracy. And all of these forces conjoined to cause the Negro in America to take a new look at himself. Negro masses all over began to reevaluate themselves. And then something else happened along with all of this. The Negro in the United States turned his eyes and his mind to Africa. And he noticed the magnificent drama of independence taking place on the stage of African history. And noticing the developments, and noticing what was happening, and noticing what was being done on the part of his black brothers and sisters in Africa, gave him a new sense of dignity in the United States and a new sense of self-respect. The Negro came to feel that he was somebody. His religion revealed to him that God loves all of his children and that all men are made in his image, and that the basic thing about a man is not his specificity but his fundamentum, not the texture of his hair or the color of his skin, but his eternal dignity and worth. And so the Negro in America could now cry out unconsciously with the eloquent poet, fleecy locks and black complexion, cannot forfeit nature's claim. Skin may differ, but affection dwells in black and white the same. And were I so tall as to reach the pole or to grasp the ocean at a span, I must be measured by my soul. The mind is the standard of the man. And with this new sense of dignity and this new sense of self-respect, a new Negro came into being with a new determination to suffer, to struggle, to sacrifice, and even to die if necessary in order to be free. And this reveals that we have come a long, long way since 1619. But if we're to be true to the facts, it is necessary to say that not only has the Negro re-evaluated his own intrinsic worth, the whole nation has come a long, long way in extending the frontiers of civil rights. And I'd like to mention just a few things that have happened in our country which reveal this. 50 years ago, or even 25 years ago, a year hardly passed when numerous Negroes were not brutally lynched by some vicious mob. Fortunately, lynchings have about ceased today. If one would go back to the turn of the century, you would find that in the southern part of the United States you had very few Negroes registered to vote. By 1948, that number had leaped to about 750,000. In 1960, it had leaped to 1,200,000. And when we went into the presidential election just a few weeks ago, that number had leaped to more than 2 million. We went into that election with more than 2 million Negroes registered to vote in the South, which meant that we in the civil rights movement, by working hard, have been able to add more than 800,000 new Negroes as registered voters in the last 3 years. This reveals that we've made strides. And then when we look at the question of economic justice, there's much to do, but we can at least say that some strides have been made. The average Negro wage earner who is employed today in the United States earns 10 times more than the average Negro wage earner of 12 years ago. The national income of the Negro is now a little better than $28 billion a year, which is more than all of the exports of the United States and more than the national budget of Canada. This reveals that we have made some strides in this area. But probably more than anything else, and you've read about it so much here and all over the world, I'm sure, we have noticed a gradual decline and even demise of the system of racial segregation. Now, the legal history of racial segregation had its beginning in 1896. Many people feel that racial segregation has been a reality in the United States a long, long time, but the fact is that this was a rather recent phenomenon in our country, just a little better than 60 years old. And it had its legal beginning with a decision known as the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which said in substance that separate but equal facilities could exist, and it made the doctrine of separate but equal the law of the land. We all know what happened as a result of the old Plessy doctrine. There was always a strict enforcement of the separate, without the slightest intention to abide by the equal. And the Negro ended up being plunged into the abyss of exploitation, where he experienced the bleakness of nagging injustice. But then something marvelous happened. The Supreme Court of our nation in 1954 examined the legal body of segregation, and on May 17th of that year pronounced it constitutionally dead. It said in substance that the old Plessy doctrine must go, that separate facilities are inherently unequal, and that to segregate a child on the basis of his race is to deny that child equal protection of the law. And so we've seen many changes since that momentous decision was rendered in 1954. 54, it came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of disinherited people all over our nation. Then something else happened, which brought joy to all of our hearts. It happened this year. It was last year after the struggle in Birmingham, Alabama, that the late President Kennedy came to realize that there was a basic issue that our country had to grapple with a sense of concern and a sense of immediacy. He made a great speech a few days before, or rather it was really on the same day that the University of Alabama was to be integrated, and Governor Wallace stood in the door and tried to block that integration. And Mr. Kennedy had to have the National Guard federalized. He stood before the nation and said in eloquent terms, the problem which we face in the area of civil rights is not merely a political issue. It is not merely an economic issue. It is at bottom a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures and as modern as the Constitution. It is a question of whether we will treat our Negro brothers as we ourselves would like to be treated. And on the heels of that great speech, he went and recommended to the Congress of our nation the most comprehensive civil rights bill ever recommended by any president of our great nation. Unfortunately, after many months of battle, and for a period we got a little tired of that. You know, there are some men in our country who like to talk a lot. Maybe you've read about the filibuster, and you know they get bogged down in the paralysis of analysis, and they will just go on and on and on, and they wanted to talk that bill to death. But President Lyndon Johnson got to work. He started calling congressmen and senators in. He started meeting day in and day out with influential people in the country and making it clear that that bill had to pass as a tribute to the late President Kennedy, but also as a tribute to the greatness of the country and as an expression of its dedication to the American dream. And it was that great day last summer that that bill came into being, and it was on July 2nd that Mr. Johnson signed that bill, and it became the law of the land. And so in America now we have a civil rights bill, and I'm happy to report to you that by and large that bill is being implemented in communities all across the South. We have seen some surprising levels of compliance, even in some communities in the state of Mississippi. And whenever you can find anything right in Mississippi, things are getting better.
Dr. Martin Luther King, speaking in London, December 7th, 1964. We'll return to the speech after this break.
Ever love must have killed at every turn. We've got to know by now what the consequences will bring. Yes, he had seen mountaintop, and he knew he could not stop. Always living with the threat of death ahead. Yeah. Folks, you'd better stop and think, for we're all heading for the brink. Hear me now. What will happen now? What's gonna happen now? That the King of Love is dead.
Nina Simone singing "The King of Love is Dead." This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In this Democracy Now! Exclusive, we return to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his own words from a recording recently discovered by the Pacifica Radio archives. This is from December 7th, 1964 in London, just days before Dr. King received the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo, Norway.
We can never forget the fact that just this summer, 3 civil rights workers were brutally murdered near Philadelphia, Mississippi. All of this reveals to us that we have not achieved the level of brotherhood. We have not achieved the brotherhood that we need and that we must have in our nation. We still have a long, long way to go. I mentioned voter registration and the fact that we had been able to add about 800,000 new registered voters in the last 2 or 3 years, the fact that it's over 2 million now. I guess that sounded like real progress, and it does represent some progress. But let me give you the other side, and that is the fact that there are still more than 10 million Negroes living in the southern part of the United States, and some 6 million of the Negroes living in the southern part of the United States are of voting age, and yet only 2 million are registered. And this means that 4 million remain unregistered, not merely because they are apathetic, not because they are complacent. This may be true of some few, but because all types of conniving methods are still being used to keep Negroes from becoming registered voters. Complex literacy tests are given which make it almost impossible for anybody to pass a test, even if he has a PhD degree in any field or a law degree from the best law schools of the world. And then actual economic reprisals are often taken out against Negroes who seek to register and vote in some of the black belt counties of Mississippi and Alabama and other places. And then some are actually faced with physical violence and sometimes physical death. This reveals that we have a great deal that must be done in this area. I mentioned economic justice, and I'm sure that that figure, $28 billion, sounded very large. That's a lot of money. But then I must go on and give you the other side if I'm to be honest about the picture. That is the fact that 42% of the Negro families of the United States still earn less than $2,000 a year, while just 16% of the white families earn less than $2,000 a year. 21% of the Negro families of America earn less than $1,000 a year, while just 5% of the white families earn less than $1,000 a year. And then we face the fact that 88% of the Negro families of America earn less than $5,000 a year, while just 58% of the white families earn less than $5,000 a year. So we can see that that is still a great gulf between the haves, so to speak, and the have-nots. And if America is to continue to grow and progress and develop and move on toward its greatness, this problem must be solved. Now, this economic problem is getting more serious because of many forces alive in our world. For many years, Negroes were denied adequate educational opportunities. For many years, Negroes were even denied apprenticeship training. And so the forces of labor and industry so often discriminated against Negroes. And this meant that the Negro ended up being limited by and large to unskilled and semi-skilled labor. Now, because of the forces of automation and cybernation, these are the jobs that are now passing away. And so the Negro wakes up in a city like Detroit, Michigan, and discovers that he's 28% of the population and about 72% of the unemployed. Now, in order to grapple with that problem, our federal government will have to develop massive retraining programs, massive public works programs, so that automation can be a blessing, as it must be, to our society and not a curse. Then the other thing, when we think of this economic problem, we must think of the fact that that is nothing more dangerous than to build a society with a segment in that society which feels that it has no stake in the society. There's nothing more dangerous than to build a society with a number of people who see life as little more than a long and desolate corridor with no exit sign. They end up with despair because they have no jobs, because they can't educate their children, because they can't live in a nice home, because They can't have adequate health facilities. We always hear of the various reasons why and the various myths concerning integration and why integration shouldn't come into being. Those people who argue against integration at this point often say, well, if you integrate the public schools, for instance, you will pull the white race back a generation. And they like to talk about the cultural lag in the Negro community. And then they go on to say, now, you know, the Negro is a criminal and he has the highest crime rate in any city that you can find in the United States. And arguments go on ad infinitum why integration shouldn't come into being. But I think there's an answer to that. And that is that if there is cultural lag in the Negro community, and there certainly is, this lag is there because of segregation and discrimination. It's there because of long years of slavery and segregation. Criminal responses are not racial but environmental. Poverty, economic deprivation, social isolation, and all of these things breed crime, whatever the racial group may be. And it is a torturous logic to use the tragic results of racial segregation as an argument for the continuation of it. It is necessary to go back. And so it is necessary to see this and to go all out to make economic justice a reality all over our nation. I mentioned that racial segregation is about dead in the United States, but it's still with us. We are about past the day of legal segregation. We have about ended de jure segregation, where the laws of the nation or of a particular state can uphold it because of the Civil Rights Bill and the Supreme Court's decision and other things. We have passed a day when the Negro can't eat at a lunch counter, with the exception of a few isolated situations, or where the Negro can't check in a motel or a hotel. We are fastly passing that day. But that is another form of segregation coming up. It is coming up through housing discrimination, joblessness, and de facto segregation in the public schools. And so the ghettoized conditions that exist make for many problems, and it makes for a hardcore de facto segregation that we must grapple with on a day-to-day basis. And so this is the problem that we face, and this is the problem that we are forced to deal with. And we are going to deal with it in a determined way. I am absolutely convinced that segregation is on its deathbed, and those who represent it, whether they be in the United States or whether they be in London, England, the system is on its deathbed. But certainly we all know that if democracy is to live in any nation, segregation must die. And as I've tried to say all over America, we've got to get rid of segregation, not merely because it will help our image, it certainly will help our image in the world. We've got to get rid of segregation not merely because it will appeal to Asian and African peoples, and this certainly will be helpful, this is important. But in the final analysis, racial discrimination must be uprooted from American society and from every society because it is morally wrong. So it is necessary to go all out and develop massive action programs to get rid of racial segregation. Now, I would like to mention one or two ideas that circulate in our society, and they probably circulate in your society and all over the world, that keep us from developing the kind of action programs necessary to get rid of discrimination and segregation. One is what I refer to as the myth of time. There are those individuals who argue that only time can solve the problem of racial injustice in the United States, in South Africa, or anywhere else. You've got to wait on time. And I know they've said to us so often in the States and to our allies in the white community, just be nice and be patient and continue to pray, and in 100 to 200 years the problem will work itself out. We've heard and we've lived with the myth of time. The only answer that I can give to that myth is that time is neutral. It can be used either constructively or destructively. I must honestly say to you that I'm convinced that the forces of ill will have often used time much more effectively than the forces of goodwill. And we may have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words and the violent actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence and indifference of the good people who sit around saying, wait on time. Somewhere along the way, it is necessary to see that human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals who are willing to be co-workers with God, and without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the primitive forces of social stagnation. And so we must help time, and we must realize that the time is always right to do right. This is so vital, and this is so necessary. Now, the other myth that gets around a great deal in our nation, and I'm sure in other nations of the world, is the idea that you can't solve the problems in the realm of human relations through legislation. You can't solve the housing problem and the job problem and all of these other problems through legislation. You've got to change the heart. We had a presidential candidate just recently who spoke about this a great deal, and I think Mr. Goldwater sincerely believed that you couldn't do anything through legislation because he voted against everything in the Senate, including the Civil Rights Bill. And he said all over the nation throughout the election that we don't need legislation, that legislation can't deal with this problem. But he was nice enough to say that you've got to change the heart. Now, I want to at least go halfway with Brother Goldwater at that point. I think he's right. If we're going to get this problem solved in America and all over the world, ultimately, people must change their hearts where they have prejudices. If we're going to solve the problems facing mankind, I would be the first to say that every white person must look down deep within and remove every prejudice that may be there, and come to see that the Negro and the colored peoples generally must be treated right, not merely because the law says it, but because it is right and because it is natural. I agree with this 100%. And I'm sure that if the problem is to be solved ultimately, men must be obedient not merely to that which can be enforced by the law, but they must rise to the majestic heights of being obedient to the unenforceable. But after saying all of that, I must go on to the other side. This is where I must leave Mr. Goldwater and others who believe that legislation has no place. It may be true that you can't legislate integration, but you can legislate desegregation. It may be true that morality cannot be legislated, but behavior can be regulated. It may be true that the law can't change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. It may be true that the law can make a man love me, but it can restrain him from lynching me, and I think that's pretty important also.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. speaking in London on December 7th, 1964. We'll return to that speech after this break. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In this Democracy Now! Exclusive, we return to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his own words from a recording recently discovered by the Pacifica Radio Archive. The speech given in London, December 7, 1964, just days before Dr. King received the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo, Norway.
Now, as you know, we have been engaged in the United States in a massive struggle and to make desegregation and finally integration a reality. And in that struggle there has been an undergirding philosophy, the philosophy of nonviolence, the philosophy and method of nonviolent resistance. And I'd like to say just a few words about the method or the philosophy that has undergirded our struggle. First, I want to say that I'm still convinced that nonviolence is the most potent weapon available to oppressed people in their struggle for freedom and justice. It has a way of disarming the opponent, exposing his moral defenses. It weakens his morale, and at the same time it works on his conscience, and he just doesn't know how to handle it. If he doesn't beat you, wonderful. If he beats you, you develop the quiet courage of accepting blows without retaliating. If he doesn't put you in jail, wonderful. Nobody with any sense loves to go to jail. But if he puts you in jail, you go in that jail and transform it from a dungeon of shame to a haven of freedom and human dignity. Even if he tries to kill you, you develop the inner conviction that there are some things so dear, some things so precious, some things so eternally true that they are worth dying for. And if a man has not discovered something that he will die for, he isn't fit to live. And this is what the nonviolent discipline says. And then the other thing about it is that it gives the individual a way of struggling to secure moral ends through moral means. One of the great debates of history has been over the whole question of ends and means. And all the way back from the days of Plato's dialogues coming on up through Machiavelli and others, there have been those individuals who argued that the end justifies the means. But in a real sense, a nonviolent philosophy comes along and says that the end is pre-existent in the means. The means represent the ideal in the making and the end in process. And so that in the long run of history, immoral means cannot bring about moral ends. Somehow man must come to the point that he sees the necessity of having ends and means cohering, so to speak. And this is one of the things that is basic in the nonviolent philosophy at its best. It gives one a way and a method of struggle which says that you can seek to secure moral ends through moral means. It also says that it is possible to struggle against an evil, unjust system with all your might and with all your heart, and even hate that unjust system, but yet you maintain an attitude of active goodwill and understanding and even love for the perpetrators of that evil system. Now, this is the most misunderstood aspect of nonviolence. And this is where those who don't want to follow the nonviolent method say a lot of bad things to those of us who talk about love. But I still go on and believe in it, because I am still convinced that it is love that makes the world go round. And somehow this kind of love can be a powerful force for social change. Now, I'm not talking about a weak love. I'm not talking about emotional bosh here. I'm not talking about some sentimental quality. I'm not talking about an affectionate response. It would be nonsense to urge oppressed people to love their violent oppressors in an affectionate sense, and I have never advised that. When Jesus said, love your enemies, I'm happy he didn't say like your enemies. It's pretty difficult to like some people. But love is greater than like. Love is understanding, creative, redemptive goodwill for all men. Theologians talk about this kind of love with the Greek word agape, which is a sort of overflowing love that seeks nothing in return. And when one develops this, you rise to the position of being able to love the person who does the evil deed while hating the deed that the person does. And I believe that this can be done. Psychiatrists are telling us now that hatred is a dangerous force, not merely for the hated, but also the hater. Many of the strange things that happen in the subconscious, many of the inner conflicts are rooted in hate. And so they are saying love or perish. This is why Eric Fromm can write a book entitled The Art of Loving, arguing that love is the supreme unifying force of life. And so it is wonderful to have a method of struggle where it is possible to stand up against segregation, to stand up against colonialism with all of your might, and yet not hate the perpetrators of these unjust systems. And I believe firmly that it is through this kind of powerful, nonviolent action, this kind of love that organizes itself into mass action, that we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation and the world into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. Certainly this is the great challenge facing us. Now I think that nonviolence can work not only in the situation that we find in our country, not only with the magnificent example that we have in India, expressed through the marvelous work of Mohandas K. Gandhi, but I think it can work in ways and in circumstances that we haven't seen it or we haven't used it before. And in this context, I would like to say something about South Africa. And I'd like to read just a statement that I've written here so that I'll be sure that I'll say everything that I have in mind about the South African situation without missing anything. I understand they are here tonight, South Africans, some of whom have been involved in the long struggle for freedom there. In our struggle for freedom and justice in the United States, which has also been so long and difficult, we feel a powerful sense of identification with those in the far more deadly struggle for freedom in South Africa. We know how Africans there and their friends of other races strove for half a century to win their freedom by nonviolent methods. We have honored Chief Lutuli for his leadership, and we know how this nonviolence was only met by increasing violence from the state, increasing repression, culminating in the shootings at Sharpeville and all that has happened since. Clearly, there's much in Mississippi and Alabama to remind the South Africans of their own country. Yet even in Mississippi, we can organize to register Negro voters. We can speak to the press. We can, in short, organize the people in nonviolent action. But in South Africa, even the mildest form of nonviolent resistance meets with years of imprisonment, and leaders over many years have been restricted and silenced and imprisoned. We can understand how, in that situation, people felt so desperate that they turned to other methods such as sabotage. Today, great leaders like Nelson Mandela and Robert Sobukwe are among the many hundreds wasting away in Robben Island prison against a massive, armed, and ruthless state which uses torture and sadistic forms of interrogation to crush human beings, even driving some to suicide. The militant opposition inside South Africa seems for the moment to be silenced. The mass of the people seems to be contained, seems for the moment unable to break from the oppression. I emphasize the word seems because we can imagine what emotions and plans must be seething below the calm surface of that prosperous police state. We know what emotions are seething in the rest of Africa and indeed all over the world. The dangers of a race war. These dangers we have had repeated and profound warning. It is in this situation with the great mass of South Africans denied their humanity, their dignity, denied opportunity, denied all human rights. It is in this situation, with many of the bravest and best South Africans serving long years of in prison, with some already executed. In this situation, we in America and Britain have a unique responsibility. For it is we, through our investments, through our government's failure to act decisively, who are guilty of bolstering up the South African tyranny. Our responsibility presents us with a unique opportunity. We can join in the one form of nonviolent action that could bring freedom and justice to South Africa, the action which African leaders have appealed for in a massive movement for economic sanctions in a world living under the appalling shadow of nuclear weapons. Do we not recognize the need to perfect the use of economic pressures? Why is trade regarded by all nations and all ideologies as sacred? Why does our government and your government in Britain refuse to intervene effectively now, as if only when there is a bloodbath in South Africa or the Korea or the Vietnam will they recognize a crisis? If the United Kingdom and the United States decided tomorrow morning not to buy South African goods, not to buy South African gold, to put an embargo on oil, if our investors and capitalists would withdraw their support for the racial tyranny that we find there, then apartheid would be brought to an end. Then the majority of South Africans of all races could at last build the shared society they desire. And so this is a challenge facing the nations of the world. And God grant that we will meet this challenge and be a part of that great creative movement that will seek to bring about change and transform those dark yesterdays of man's inhumanity to man into bright tomorrows of justice and peace and goodwill. And may I say to you that the problem of racial injustice is not limited to any one nation. We know now that this is a problem spreading all over the globe. And right here in London and right here in England, you know so well that thousands and thousands of colored people are migrating here from many, many lands, from the West Indies, from Pakistan, from India, from Africa. And they have the just right to come to this great land, and they have the just right to expect justice and democracy in this land. And England must be eternally vigilant, for if not, the same kind of ghettos will develop that we have in the Harlems of the United States. The same problems of injustice, the same problems of inequality in jobs will develop. And so I say to you that the challenge before every citizen of goodwill of this nation is to go all out to make democracy a reality for everybody, so that everybody in this land will be able to live together, and that all men will be able to live together as brothers. You know, there are certain words in every academic discipline that soon become stereotypes and cliches. Every academic discipline has its technical vocabulary. Modern psychology has a word that is probably used more than any other word in modern psychology. It is the word maladjusted. You've heard that word. This is the ringing cry of modern child psychology. And certainly we all want to live well-adjusted lives in order to avoid neurotic and schizophrenic personalities. But I must say to you this evening, my friends, as I come to a close, that there are some things in my own nation, and there are some things in the world which I'm proud to be maladjusted. to which I call upon all men of good will to be maladjusted until the good society is realized. I must honestly say to you that I never intend to become adjusted to segregation, discrimination, colonialism, and these particular forces. I must honestly say to you that I never intend to adjust myself to religious bigotry. I must honestly say to you that I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few. I must say to you tonight that I never intend to become adjusted to the madness of militarism and the self-defeating effects of physical violence. But in a day when Sputniks and explorers are dashing through outer space and guided ballistic missiles are carving highways of death through the stratosphere, no nation can win a war. It is no longer the choice between violence and nonviolence. It is either nonviolence or non-existence. The alternative to disarmament, the alternative to a greater suspension of nuclear tests, the alternative to strengthening the United Nations and thereby disarming the whole world may well be a civilization plunged into the abyss of annihilation. And I assure you that I will never adjust to the madness of militarism. You see, it may well be that our whole world is in need at this time for a new organization, the International Association for the Advancement of Creative Maladjustment. Men and women who will be as maladjusted as the prophet Amos, who in the midst of the injustices of his day could cry out in words that echo across the centuries, "Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." As maladjusted as the late Abraham Lincoln, the great president of our nation, who had the vision to see that the United States could not survive half slave and half free. As maladjusted as Thomas Jefferson, who in the midst of an age amazingly adjusted to slavery, could etch across the pages of history words lifted to cosmic proportions. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. As maladjusted as Jesus of Nazareth, who could say to the men and women of his day, "He who lives by the sword will perish by the sword." And through such maladjustment, we will be able to emerge from the long and desolate midnight of man's inhumanity to man into the bright and glittering daybreak of freedom and justice. May I say to you that I still believe that mankind will rise up to the occasion in spite of the darkness of the hour, in spite of the difficulties of the moment, in spite of these days of emotional tension when the problems of the world are gigantic in extent and chaotic in detail. I still have faith in the future, and I still believe that we can build this society of brotherhood and this society of peace. We have a song that we sing in our movement, and we've joined hands to sing it so often, behind jail bars. I can remember times that we've been in jail cells made for 12 people, and yet you would find some 15 or 20 there. Yet we could go on and lift our voices and sing it. I mentioned it yesterday afternoon as I was preaching at St. Paul's. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome. And somehow I believe that mankind will overcome. And I believe that the forces of evil will be defeated. I believe this because Carlyle is right. No lie can live forever. I believe that we shall overcome because William Cullen Bryant is right. Truth-crushed earth will rise again. I believe that we shall overcome because James Russell Lowell is right. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. With this faith, we will be able to adjourn the councils of despair and bring new light into the dark chambers of pessimism. With this faith, we will be able to transform this pending cosmic elegy into a creative psalm of peace and brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to speed up the day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, Hindus and Muslims, theists and atheists, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. We have a long, long way to go before this problem is solved, but thank God we've made strides. We've come a long, long way. So I close by quoting the words of an old Negro slave preacher who didn't quite have his grammar and diction right, but who uttered words of great symbolic profundity. Lord, we ain't what we want to be. We ain't what we ought to be. We ain't what we gonna be. But thank God, we ain't what we was. Thank you.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. speaking in London at City Temple on December 7th, 1964. He would receive the Nobel Peace Prize 3 days later in Oslo, Norway. The recording of this speech was recently discovered by Brian DeShazer, director of the Pacifica Radio Archives. To get a copy of today's show and to learn more about how this rare King recording was discovered, go to our website at democracynow.org. The Pacifica Radio Archives website is pacificaradioarchives.org.
3 words. Somebody give me 3 words. 3 words about what you just saw.
Just any comment would be greatly appreciated.
Inspirational.
3 words.
Powerful. Love, compassion, and affection.
Love, compassion, affection. What else did I hear?
Inspirational.
Inspirational.
Kept it real.
Kept it real. Kept it 100.
100.
Very good. Anybody else? Eye-opening. Very good. Eye-opening. Anybody else? I'm very interactive. I don't just talk. I want you to talk to me as well. Anybody else?
I like to see something. I think it's I think I've always known this even after like slavery and what happened now, how they stayed so humble and they're still kind, and how he mentioned that, like you said, to find the answer to the question if we still symbolize Christian love, like he said. And but nowadays I think we don't really.
It's when I say these words, I never ask for special accommodations. I ask for a level playing field. What does that mean to you? I never ask for special accommodations. I only ask for a level playing field. Yes.
It's not like they're asking for like a reprimand, not reprimand, like they're asking for the same opportunities that have been offered to people hundreds of years before that. They're not asking to be, given everything they've been denied. They're just asking, now it's time for us to have the same opportunities, the same chances.
Exactly. Equality. That's to me, that's what I took from this. As a child growing up in the 60s, I was one of those children. Yeah, I know I look really young, right?
Sure.
As a child growing up in the 60s, I can remember going through having to be bused out of my community an hour away to go to a school. They closed the schools in my community. I lived in the black neighborhood, and I had to be bused to schools in the white communities that were an hour away. So I'd have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, get on a bus, and at 5 o'clock, and then I got to school at 6 o'clock. I didn't get home in the evening time until 6 p.m. because of the bus ride and just everything around that. And so when we talk about separate but equal, it wasn't that we as black folks were asking for anything different than what our counterparts were asking for. We were asking for a level playing field. And what do you think about when I say we were asking for a level playing field? And I know you said it.
The same opportunities that have been given to people.
The same textbooks.
Yeah.
The same restrooms. The same drinking fountains. We just asked for the same, and that wasn't the case. And that's what Dr. King is talking about when he says, you know, we shall overcome. At some point, that hate in your heart has to turn to love, because there is no law that's going to change anything until you change your mind, your thought process, and you begin to love. You know, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these three is what?
Love.
It's love. It's love. And that's what's going to have to change. We have to change our mindset. And until we do that, nothing is going to change. Nothing is going to change. So when we talk about, Dr. King asked, he said something very key. He talked about, we've come a long way. What does that mean to you? We've come a long way since, and I know some of you weren't even an inkling in your parents' eyes. We've come a long way from what you saw here to what you see today. What are your thoughts when you hear that? What are your thoughts? You are amazing.
The first thing that I think of is, I mean, when you say we come a long way, you're also insinuating that there's still a lot more to accomplish. So it's not like you're saying, all right, guys, we did it. Let's pat ourselves on the back and then wait a week and then start over. It's saying we're doing a good job now, but we can't stop it.
Right. There's so much more ground to cover. We have to be consistent. We have to keep pushing forward. There's so much more that we need to do. Every generation is different. Every generation it's different. Your generation, you're the tech. This is the tech generation, right? Millennials, yeah, you're the tech generation. Every generation is different. What my generation did to your generation, we gave you electronic babysitters. You know what I mean by that? We gave you the iPads. We gave you the cell phones. We gave you the TVs. We didn't teach you how to have dialogue. We didn't teach you how to have communication back and forth. And this is so important, putting everyone at the table to have intelligent conversation about what Dr. King is saying. Me having dialogue with you tells me who you are. I see your heart. I see who you are. But not everybody can do that. Not everybody can do that. Not everybody can look me in the eye and talk to me. You know? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I saw a hand back there.
I was just gonna say, basically, we're not where we would love to be with it. We're better than what we were before, but we're not all the way where everyone would want to be loved where we're at. Because we all may have our own opinions, and some people are still stuck how it was back then. Majority of it, I can say it has changed, but there's that still 1/3 of those people who are still stuck how it was back then and not how it should be now, or how it should have been back then also.
Very good, very good. Did you all know that it was against the law for people of color to read? Did you all know that? It was against the law. Why do you think it was against the law? Yes.
We wanted to keep them oppressed so that way they wouldn't rebel and feel like they would have equal rights just because.
Exactly. Because if black folks knew that they had been free 100 years ago, do you think they would have allowed themselves to continue to be enslaved? Reading is empowerment. Dr. King talked about self-respect, developing that self-respect. When my daughters, my oldest daughter is 24, and my youngest is 17, and we laugh together now because when they were growing up, during the summers, I would turn the cable on, and during the rest of the school year, I'd turn the cable off. And when they got in trouble, I'd take things away from them. And it got to a point when I took things away from them, I got my books. They would go in their room and they would read. They were okay. Even now, when I look at their credit card bills, when I look at their bank statements, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, they're buying books, they're readers, they're empowered. And my daughters are so strong. They're strong in their thoughts. They're strong in their wills. It's because they're independent. They believe in themselves and they believe in something. And that's what we as a people, when you talk about oppression, for so long, when you talk about oppression, you know, it's easy for somebody to say, well, why would you allow yourself to go through that? You all are psychology, sociology majors. Psychology, so think about the mind. When you play on that mind for so long and you have that, you think that way, you have nothing else. You have nothing else. Share your thoughts with me. Anybody? Yes.
Yeah, Melita, I also want to point out that you guys may have already known or caught it on the video that even as great as Dr. King was, he too had somebody that he looked up to. Aside from Jesus Christ, who was his personal savior, he also modeled his life after Mahatma Gandhi. Now, if you know about Gandhi, although now they're trying to take it away from him, we grew up knowing that he's the one who said, you be the change that you want to see in the world. Now, they were talking about the heart. I know the young lady said that where we would like to be. As long as you know where you are going, you will have a sense of focus. You will never really lose if you know where you're going. Question is, Melita and I, along with JC and some of the people here, may be a little older, but do remember that you are the change. And I've seen the change. I grew up in Africa from a tribe that every time we rise up to the occasion, we got assassinated. Until one person from my tribe came here and married a white woman and fathered the child known as Barack Obama. So I worked diligently to elect Barack Obama twice because I knew that it took me to come to America to go to school as an orphan to find somebody from my tribe and call that our first president. So it's not just our president of the United States, it's the president in my culture too. I just don't talk about it. But his father was a Luo from my tribe. Why am I saying that? Focus. If you know where you are going, you can achieve. And that's what I see in Dr. King. He knew where we were going.
He had a purpose.
He had a purpose. And that's what you have to have. Doesn't matter what age you are. Be focused.
All right. It's a great discussion that we have, and we would like to continue our discussion the day after tomorrow, Thursday. And Dr. Hill, Robert Hill, he is a Dean of Student Services, and he's going to moderate instead of, Melita, because she's been doing a lot of work. So I would like to see you again. Now, these two giants have ideologically somewhat different. And Dr. Hill is going to talk about Malcolm X, Malcolm Little, this Thursday, as to perhaps Dr. King's ideology, nonviolence. So there is going to be a great deal of contrast that the Dr. Hill is going to illustrate, and we're going to watch some of his the speeches that he prepared for us. So now, is there anybody who hasn't signed? Okay, here goes. And any questions or comments? Yes?
So for your assignment, do you want us to write like a page?
Yes, please. Yeah, Okay, any other, Dr. Hill, do you want to have something to pertaining MLK?
It's going to be a really interesting contrast. If you've seen this film and footage and you're a little bit of a more knowledgeable about Dr. King. A lot of people, many Americans do not want to have Malcolm as part of the history and the dialogue of difference, so to speak. He was very unique, he was very intelligent. The difference between intelligence and education, I would encourage you, as you sit here and you check off the box of your requirements, to continue to be pursuing intelligence along with education, okay? That means you have to think. You have to be critical thinkers, okay? And that's what I'm going to ask you to do when you look at Malcolm. And really listen. Don't listen to or have a preconceived notion of who he was, because he was not a violent man. He was not a violent man. Matter of fact, I've done this dialogue between the two many times, and who I associate myself with, as if all black folks are alike. We're not. We have variance within our black culture. We may share hair texture, we may share skin tone, and we might be lumped into a plethora of stereotypes.
There's a diversity within the culture.
Absolutely. It's intra-group diversity and variation. Okay, my brother here is from Africa, but we share a brotherhood, but we may not share the same values or the same philosophies. All white folks ain't alike, believe it or not. And some of us lump them into categories because we don't have enough boxes. Okay, we're limited. But I want to say this to you guys. I know there are requirements that you have to have in order to graduate. You might be in this class and you might have to attend. I know we are in the Instagram, Twitter, instantaneous culture, and it's difficult to sit through an hour-long speech. But I encourage you to maybe even, I know you have to have notes, but maybe put pen and paper down and just let it impede your soul. Because for learning goes on when it's not necessarily mandated. Okay, so I'm looking forward to tomorrow.
Okay, so I would like to see you back Thursday, and I thank you very much for coming and being part of this change. So you be the changes.